To wish this coming true.
Smooth talker. You're dangerous.
Scott, is she missing because you love me?
You set me up. He's 4 blocks away. Get out of the house now. You know, we had in this truck a double-edged dagger and a map.
The map.
To your office.
A special movie presentation.
You've already guessed all the answers, haven't you?
Amber Frey, witness for the prosecution.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
By now, a month and a half since Laci disappeared, Scott's family seems to be his only defenders. 3 days after the vigil, they hold a press conference in San Diego to show their support.
Yeah, he's looking for Laci. That is his whole purpose. And he's continued to do that since day one.
At the end of our last episode, Scott Peterson confessed the truth about his marriage to his new girlfriend, Amber Frey. He was in tears, riddled with grief and guilt over having told her he'd never been married, and said he hated himself for being dishonest with her. He said he'd understand if she hated him too, and that it might be easier if she chose to walk away and never speak to him again. He took her hands in his and looked her in the eyes, tearfully telling her he'd been married, and he was a complete mess by the time he said he'd lost his wife, and was preparing to spend his first Christmas without her. Then he said he'd spent the weekend before on a fishing trip in the San Francisco Bay with some friends, but couldn't enjoy himself because he felt so guilty. So he traveled to Fresno on the afternoon of Monday the 9th of December, prepared to be completely transparent with Amber and clear his conscience. He sobbed continuously as he went on about how much he regretted his lies, and every few sentences he would stop and ask if she was angry with him. It must have been a surprise for him to hear her say she wasn't angry, but thankful. That's right, she thanked Scott for revealing such a painful truth to her, grateful that he trusted her and had courage enough to share it. Scott said he was intrigued by her reaction, and told her again how amazing she was. Amber felt terrible for him, and though she certainly wasn't pleased about being lied to, she understood his motivation for being dishonest and respected him for telling her the truth. When he said he hadn't worked through the loss and lied about his marriage because it was so painful, she only wanted to comfort him and console his grief. He was in such a distraught state she didn't press him for details, never asking any direct questions about his marriage or his wife's passing, but knowing he was coming up on his first Christmas without her, she knew the tragedy must have been fairly recent. She recognized that he might need more time to work through his grief, and she worried he might be moving on too quickly, especially knowing he wasn't yet in a place where he could even speak of his marriage, due to it being so painful. Those concerns did provoke one question from Amber. Was he sure he was ready to have a relationship with her? When Scott said, "God, yes," in response, her worries were alleviated a bit. Although the topic would come up again just a week later. The next day, Amber's daughter Ayanna, who was just under 2 at the time, had to be rushed to the hospital. She tripped on a rug and split her head open on a stereo cabinet, sending Amber rushing to the emergency room to get her stitched up. She called Scott from the hospital, but he didn't answer and she didn't want to worry him with a voicemail. Ayanna fortunately wasn't hurt badly, feeling well enough to attend preschool the next day and a birthday party with Scott and her mom the next evening. He'd driven back to Fresno by late morning on the 11th, so he and Amber could visit the Fashion Fair mall to have him fitted for a tuxedo while Ayanna was in school. The two had plans to attend a fundraiser at the World Sports Cafe on the 14th, and the dress code was formal. But even as they reserved the tux, he warned Amber that he may not be able to go with her that coming Saturday. Scott said he might get pulled into a meeting with his boss that day, giving himself an out if he couldn't get away from Modesto according to plan, knowing Laci expected him to attend a Christmas party with her that same evening. They left the mall and headed back to Amber's place, where Scott waited while she gathered her little girl from school that afternoon. She said Scott behaved like a perfect angel all day, and he was extra careful and sweet with Ayanna as well. Amber even asked him to change the bandage over her daughter's stitches, and he very gingerly complied, while she slipped into a pair of jeans for the party. They took Anna with them to Tommy's birthday celebration at the country club in Fresno. You'll recall that Tommy is Shawn Sibley's fiancé. Shawn Sibley is Amber's best friend and hosted the party that evening. Shawn also took several pictures that night, including a photo of Scott in a blue shirt, with Amber at his side. She saw that picture again years later as it was identified in front of the jury during Scott's trial, but Amber didn't need it to remember what he'd worn that night. She had a vivid picture of him in that same blue button-up shirt just weeks afterward, on a newscast covering his missing pregnant wife. He was completely back to his charming personable self with everyone at the party, but Amber recalled that Shawn was acting a little odd that evening, shooting her strange looks all night. Scott spent the night with Amber on the 11th, but she never did get a chance to ask Shawn what was on her mind at the party. But a couple of days later, when her best friend came in to get a massage, she found out. Amber could sense something was off when she came into American Body Works that day, as if Shawn was keeping something from her, and she somehow knew it had to do with Scott Peterson. Amber eventually asked her if there was something she'd forgotten to tell her about him, and Shawn immediately became very upset, telling Amber, quote, "I found out completely by accident, and I really wanted to tell you. But Scott was crying, and he begged me to let him tell you about his wife himself, so I'm sorry. I feel like I've lied to my best friend." End quote. It turns out, Shawn had been aware Scott was married for nearly a week by then. So let's back up a bit, and find out just how and when Shawn Sibley learned she'd set her best friend up with a married man. It should also be noted that Shawn met Scott on the 24th of October, which was his 30th birthday. His wife Laci tried to put plans together for a big celebration to mark the occasion, but just like their Christmas Eve dinner at Sharon's, she couldn't get Scott to commit to a date. Laci settled for a big dinner party after he returned home from Anaheim, but it's heartbreaking to know that while she was thinking of him and his birthday plans, he was working hard at picking up women, including Shawn, telling her he was sick of one-night stands with bimbos, and longed for a serious relationship with a real woman. Of course, at the time, Shawn Sibley had no idea he already had that and so much more, waiting to lovingly celebrate his birthday back in Modesto. On the 6th of January, Shawn and a few co-workers were talking about their job hunting experience, and when Scott's name came up, it rang a bell with Mike Almasary. Mike worked with Shawn, but he'd interviewed with Scott for a sales position the summer before. He was beat out for the job by Eric Olson, who Shawn also met in Anaheim, but when Mike told her Scott Peterson lived in Modesto, she was confused. The Scott she'd met at the trade convention in Anaheim was from Sacramento. What were the chances two men with the same name worked for Trade Corp in California? She knew something wasn't adding up, and asked Mike to tell her more about the Scott Peterson he'd met over the summer. During the interview at the Modesto Applebee's for the sales position the previous June, Scott had told Mike he was married, and that he and his wife just purchased a home there the year before. Hearing all of that, Shawn left the table and called Scott immediately. She was absolutely livid. He answered the phone and she said, "I heard you're married, what the hell's up with that?" Scott denied it repeatedly, until she finally told him, quote, "You know, if I find you're lying to me, I'm going to kick the shit out of you." End quote. As the call went on, she was getting more and more upset, and he was continuing to lie to her, so she hung up. But knowing he was full of it, she made a beeline for her desk, where she found Eric Olson's business card and dialed his cell number. Remember, Eric was Scott's employee after beating out Mike Almasary for the sales job in Modesto, and he received his salary from Scott. When Shawn called asking questions about his relationship, Eric told her he didn't want to get involved. He suggested she contact Scott directly if she needed information about his personal life. But Shawn wasn't interested in hearing more denials from Scott, so she didn't call him back. And apparently she wasn't quite ready to share what she learned with Amber at this point, because she hadn't tried to contact her either. When Scott tried to call Shawn an hour later, she was still furious with him and didn't answer the phone, but the voicemail he'd left her changed everything. He sobbed heavily through the entire message, saying, "I'm sorry I lied to you earlier. I have been married, it's just too painful for me to talk about." Shawn tried to return his call just before leaving her office for the day, but this time, it was Scott who didn't answer. She left him a message to call her at home that evening, but when she got there, Sharon did some digging. Still very suspicious of Scott, she paid $30 to search a website for county records, hoping to uncover his marriage license. But strangely, even though she now knew from Mike that Trade Corp was based in Modesto, she'd started her search in Sacramento. Of course, she didn't find anything for Scott Peterson there, and just as she was about to run another search for Modesto, he called her back. He was crying hysterically when she answered the phone, telling her, quote, "I'm so sorry I lied to you earlier. I'd been married, and I lost my wife. It's too painful for me to talk about. Please just give me the opportunity to tell Amber in person. I'm going to be in town on Monday. Please don't tell her, just please let me have the chance to tell her myself." End quote. He was still crying pretty hard when Sharon said, "Scott, I don't care if you're widowed or you're divorced, all I care about is, are you currently married right now?" When he emphatically said no, absolutely not, it turned the entire situation on its head. Sharon became the one who was apologizing, feeling guilty for accusing him and sympathizing with his tremendous loss. And apparently it also put a dead stop to her search for his marriage license. Even though she'd already paid to access the records and remained highly suspicious of Scott, Sharon said she didn't look into it any further, never searching the records for Modesto or anywhere else. 2 days after Sharon Sibley agreed to keep Scott's secret from Amber, jeopardizing their 8 years of friendship, we have our first mention of Fresno Detective Richard Byrd. Detective Byrd was a personal friend of Amber's, and while it's not known how long they'd been acquainted or how close they were, it is known that Amber spoke on the phone with him for over an hour on the 8th, the day before Scott's confession. Ultimately, it would be Richard who confirmed that Amber's Scott Peterson was the same Scott Peterson with a missing wife out of Modesto, but on the 9th, Sharon and Amber thought they'd met a man with a broken heart, perhaps not ready to move on. Worst case scenario, he was a liar and a cheat, but the 20 days in between made them wonder whether he was actually a monster. Sharon felt terrible for him when he told her about his loss, just as Amber did later, but Sharon also gave Scott an ultimatum on that call. She told him if he didn't tell Amber the truth while he was in Fresno on the 9th, she would. Scott agreed to the terms, and had his story well prepared by then, adding the bit about his ruined weekend on Greg Rogue's boat on the 7th and 8th, and telling Amber he'd felt so guilty about lying to her he couldn't enjoy himself. But the fact was that Sharon cornered him, and he had nowhere to go with his lies but into a deeper hole with his girlfriend, or back home to his wife. He very likely was stressed over the previous 2 days, but it wasn't because he was weighed down by guilt on the waters of the San Francisco Bay. After he tearfully confessed his twisted reality to Amber, he secretly called Sharon to let her know he'd come clean. But then he immediately asked her to lie again, begging her not to tell Amber she'd ever discovered he was married. While Sharon promised she wouldn't go out of her way to share the truth, she also warned him that if Amber asked her directly, she wasn't going to lie to her friend again. A few days later, Sharon would be put to the test. The 9th of December turned out to be a busy day for Scott. He'd spend his afternoon in Fresno, successfully duping Amber and Sharon with his egregiously manipulative lies, but that morning, he'd also found the time to buy himself a boat. He met with Bruce Peterson around 10 o'clock to purchase the 14-foot game fisher, just a few hours before he told his girlfriend his wife was dead. Meanwhile, back in Modesto, Laci was very much alive, though many think by this point she and baby Connor were living on borrowed time. She carried on with her day-to-day routine, as bubbly and positive as she could be with swollen feet, and on the 13th of December, she picked up her Geneve dress watch from Marian Felix at Edwards Jewelers. With her nails painted a beautiful shade of red, she paid the repair fee and giggled her way out the door, after Marianne teased her about the cute new wattles she'd acquired now that she was closer to her due date. In Fresno that same day, Amber gave Sharon a massage, learning the truth about what spurred Scott's confession. Sharon felt guilty for keeping his secret, and even though Amber wasn't angry and understood why she'd kept it from her, Sharon didn't care for the position he'd put her in with her friend, and she remained suspicious of Scott. She knew Amber was developing feelings for him, so before leaving that day, she reminded her that her new boyfriend had lied to both of them multiple times, and she warned her to be careful pursuing a relationship with Scott Peterson. But while Amber's best friend was warning her not to blindly rush into things with a suspicious man in Fresno, Laci's best friend Stacy was prepping to host a Christmas party for several of their closest friends in Modesto, including the Petersons. On the morning of December 14th, still several hours before Stacy's party, Scott and Laci took a trip to the pawn shop. Laci told shop owner Victoria Brooks that she'd inherited some things from her grandmother and wanted to declutter her jewelry box. But when it was time to record the sale, Laci realized she didn't have her wallet, which was a bit out of character. They wound up using Scott's ID to sell the jewelry, including a few gold chains, a charm, and a ring. While she wrote out the receipt and gave Laci the $110 she planned to split with her sister Amy, Victoria noticed that she was a bit annoyed with Scott touching and rubbing her stomach before they left. She was probably even more annoyed to learn he had to take a last-minute trip to San Francisco, meaning she would have to attend Stacy's party alone. She tried to convince Scott to reschedule, suggesting he make the drive the following Monday, but he said it couldn't be done. He said he had to go to the San Francisco airport to meet his boss, who'd only be there for a short time during a layover, and rescheduling wasn't an option. But this was a lie. He was actually driving to Fresno for a date with his new girlfriend. Interestingly, he'd used the same trip to San Francisco excuse on Amber, when he told her he couldn't go to an art show with her the week before. Laci and her mother both expressed concerns about him leaving town that night, not because he'd missed the party or they thought he was lying, but because of the weather. It was raining with high winds, and the highway leading to San Francisco was particularly treacherous in those conditions. Lucky for Scott, he wasn't really going to San Francisco, and the drive to Fresno was far less hazardous. But the slick highway drive to the party was a reality for Laci, and she had to be extra careful as she made her way north to Bridle Pass Lane on her own. Stacy hosted the party from her boyfriend's place, but by the time Laci pulled up in front of Jake Zamate's house, the street was flooded, forcing her to park several houses away. And true to form, she hadn't arrived empty-handed. Impeccably dressed in red, complete with nails painted to match and a pair of beautiful black sky-high heels, she was winded by the time she rang the bell. Stacy opened the door to Laci on the porch, a plant in one hand and food for the party in the other, sharing a bit of her two favorite things in the world, with her most cherished friends for the last time. She was a bit worn out by the time she made it into the house, telling Stacy's mom Terry Western it was hard for her to walk. Terry took one look at her feet and jokingly said, "Well duh, Laci, you're wearing high heels." Laci sat in Stacy's recliner for the majority of the time she was there, and she didn't stay long, mentioning that she'd been tired lately. But she did share her excitement over baby Connor while she was there, telling her friends how ready she was to finally hold her little boy, before making her way back to the empty house on Covina. Meanwhile, Scott was on Amber's doorstep in Fresno carrying 3 dozen roses, 2 bottles of champagne, and an armful of groceries. She greeted him at the door and he quickly tried to get fresh with her in the kitchen with the flowers, but she promptly cut him off. He'd taken one of the stems and began sweet-talking her as he brushed the petals along her skin, until she brought up her conversation with Sean the day before. She moved away from him, less thankful and more angry now as she considered his tearful confession a week ago, after learning he and Sean kept the secret from her for days, likely frustrated that he chose to compound his lies, and then persuaded her friend to deceive her as well. Realizing the truth hadn't come from a place of guilt and regret, but from being exposed after Sean stumbled onto the facts, she also realized his guilty conscience during his boating trip the weekend before had little to nothing to do with his confession. Amber asked him very plainly if he would have ever told her the truth, if Sean hadn't found out. Of course, he said yes, called her sweetie, and reassured her that he was absolutely going to tell her on his own, never mind what Sean learned in the meantime. And then he convinced her that he really did live in Sacramento, and that although he kept a warehouse in Modesto, he'd never owned a home there. It seems things got complicated with Scott right off the bat, but for Amber it was fairly simple. All she wanted to know was whether or not she could trust him. More specifically, she needed to know if she could trust him with her heart, but when she asked him that question multiple times that night, he never gave her a direct answer. Instead, she got the same response he gave her weeks later, when she asked if he was involved in Laci's disappearance. He grinned and told her, "Sweetie, you already know the answer to that." She told him that no, she didn't know the answer, and asked him again if she could trust him with her heart. This time he answered by saying, quote, "You know, I live a certain lifestyle, and I can see you living that lifestyle too. When I get back from Europe, I need to make some decisions. Can you say yes to me without question?" End quote. She didn't understand what that meant and was disappointed after asking again, just to have him repeat that she already knew the answer. A few minutes later she switched up the question a bit, instead asking him again if he was sure he was ready for a relationship with her. But instead of replying, he quieted her with a passionate kiss, and she headed off to her bedroom to get dressed soon after. But as she walked down the hall, Scott told her not to come back into the kitchen for a while, so he could prepare a surprise. She returned in her strapless red evening gown to find him holding something behind his back, and was delighted to see him reveal a pink lady caramel apple. Scott remembered her story about the pink ladies, and he brought everything required to make her favorite treat from scratch, including a double boiler. They shared the apple, and it must have smoothed Amber's ruffled feathers over his compounded lies and evasive answers about trust, because by the time he was dressed in his rented tuxedo, she wanted him to confirm that he was her boyfriend. She said there would be a lot of people she knew at the fundraiser that night, and casually asked how she should introduce him, but he didn't know, and didn't offer any suggestions. With that, she asked if he was seeing anyone else. He of course told her no, adding that she was the only one he called sweetheart and that he was completely monogamous. Which led to Amber wondering if it would be alright to present him as her boyfriend to her friends and colleagues. He told her he thought that was totally appropriate, and encouraged her validation of the relationship. The two of them spent their first and only evening out as an official couple, and while the pictures taken that night fueled scandalous headlines and caused immeasurable heartbreak for Laci's friends and family, particularly for her mother Sharon, they also became the focus of a lawsuit. The photos taken of Scott Peterson and Amber Frey that caused such drama weren't snapped at the event itself, but well afterward, at the apartment of a woman named Sharon Vincent. Sharon, or Saki as Amber knew her, went to the World Sports Cafe with them that night. She'd actually kept them waiting because she was running late, and the two went to a nearby restaurant called Casanova's, killing time over more champagne and appetizers until she was finally dressed and ready to go. They picked up Saki, and went back to the restaurant for more drinks before heading to the fundraiser, but before they left Casanova's for the second time, the girls took a trip to the restroom. Amber told Saki how happy she was and what a great catch she'd found in Scott, but her friend didn't seem too impressed. Even when she told her about his smooth moves with the rose and the pink lady caramel apple, Saki's lack of enthusiasm was obvious. Perhaps Amber should have taken it as a sign of what was to come, but at the time she thought her friend was just being cautious. When the ladies returned to the table, Scott said the waiter hit on him while they were gone, and his reaction wasn't at all what Amber expected. She asked if it bothered him to have another guy flirt with him, and he told her no, saying, quote, "It's totally flattering when another guy finds you attractive," end quote. They attended the fundraiser as a trio, and eventually went back to Saki's apartment for more drinks after the event shut down, but not before stopping off for film. Saki started snapping pictures before they even got to her house, and they took several more photos as they drank and danced together. As Scott and Amber left Saki Vincent's apartment in the early hours of the next morning, Amber couldn't have imagined that she just spent the evening with not one, but two wolves in sheep's clothing. It turns out, Saki was ultimately the reason why detectives shared Scott's affair with Laci's family on the 15th of January, because Sharon Saki Vincent forced their hand. By the time Sharon saw the photo with Bueller and Brocchini at the police station, Saki had long since sold it to the National Enquirer and People magazine. The tabloid contacted the Modesto PD on the 15th to warn them that the photos would run the next day, and detectives working the case had no choice but to warn both sides of the family about the affair, before they learned about it through the media. We'll get into Amber's eventual contact with the Modesto PD and how Scott's parents reacted to his affair as we continue the timeline in our next episode, but we'll wrap up Saki's story here. She called Amber after the pictures hit the press and pretended to be concerned for her, knowing she'd leaked the photos herself. And months later, she sued People magazine over the most scandalous picture she'd sold them. It's the photo most often used to illustrate Scott's sinister betrayal of his wife, and now you know the photo outlines Saki's treachery as well. But even more interesting than that, is that if you look closely at the picture Saki snapped in her living room as Amber posed in front of the Christmas tree with her new boyfriend, you'll see that she'd captured herself in the infamous photo as well. Saki can be seen in the picture that hangs on the wall behind them, and the lawsuit stemmed from the magazine's failure to edit her out before it went to print. After the photo she sold circulated the globe in mid-January, Saki claimed to be horrified to have her face appear alongside Scott Peterson's. She cropped up with a more recent lawsuit in 2018 as well, claiming wrongful termination after a sexual harassment complaint, and though we don't know the details on how either case resolved, we do have a quote from Amber about the suit against People magazine over the pictures. After learning Saki'd been paid $5,000 for each photo she sold to the press, Amber said the following about the lawsuit, quote, "That's appalling that she's doing this. She doesn't want her picture in the magazine, but it's okay that she sells the photos and profits off me, Laci Peterson and her baby?" End quote. Scott stayed overnight with Amber after they left Saki's apartment, where they proceeded to have unprotected sex just before dawn on the 15th. In the aftermath of that, the two of them engaged in a conversation where Amber revealed that she was a single mother, not only seeking a serious relationship, but more children as well. However, Scott expressed his aversion towards having children, and told her he'd considered having a vasectomy, which took Amber by surprise. He could see she was taken aback, but told her again that he didn't want any biological children, saying he'd be satisfied with raising Ayana as his own. She worried that he'd already made such a sweeping and potentially permanent decision while he was still so young, but she was also concerned about their longevity as a couple, because she knew she wanted more children. She told Scott that night that she loved being pregnant, and explained that Ayana was a gift from God, saying her daughter brightened her world in ways she didn't know were possible. She'd enjoyed every moment carrying and parenting Ayana, and she told Scott she dreamed of going through the joys of pregnancy and parenthood in a loving relationship, something that she never had with Ayana's father Anthony, explaining that a committed man to share the experience with would have made God's amazing gift just that much sweeter. But Scott didn't say much after she expressed her clear desire to have more kids, which is a bit odd after they'd just been so careless with their relations. Instead of addressing their opposing viewpoints, he got very close to her face, studying her with what Amber called great tenderness, before telling her how beautiful she was, inside and out. Scott left Amber's place around noon on the 15th, laying out his extensive travel schedule over the next several weeks. He told her he had plans to hit the highway that afternoon for a business trip to New Mexico, with another trip to Arizona lined up directly after. On the 23rd he had plans to go on a duck hunt with his father in Kennebunkport, Maine over Christmas. Of course, his travels would be peppered with trips to his house in Sacramento as well, but he wouldn't be in California much at all through the new year, heading to Europe directly after Christmas for another business obligation. He told her he'd call her as often as he could, and because she knew she wouldn't see him again for over a month, she sent him away with a picture of her and Ayana to remember them while they were apart. But tragically, the plans Scott laid out for Amber were as fantastical as her visions of a future with him. Every bit of what he'd told her was a lie, a glassy illusion he'd carefully crafted to shroud the truth, and not long after things began to unravel back in Modesto, a more accurate picture of Scott Peterson came into focus for Amber in Fresno as well. He'd left her full of hope and promise on the 15th of December. She was confident enough to announce their love to the world and already anxious to see him again before his truck pulled away from the curb. But his outlandish lies had covered up a dark, twisted reality, and Amber Frey didn't see Scott Peterson again until he faced a death sentence for the murder of his pregnant wife Laci. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked the episode and want to hear more stories like this one, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when we post new content. You can also support the channel through our Patreon linked in the description, or by clicking the Super Thanks button below. Find us on Instagram and Twitter at Dead2Me and on TikTok at Dead2Me You can also visit our website at deadspacecrime.com. Until next time, stay safe, be kind, and memento mori.